Hi everyone and welcome to another reading vlog. Welcome to what is possibly going to be a new series on my channel. I haven't really decided yet, it all kind of depends on how well this video goes, but basically I'm going to be reading the oldest and the newest of a certain genre from my TBR. So I got this video idea from Crystal of Crystal's Bookish Life, who did this video quite recently but with romance books, and it got me thinking about how much books have changed. Like when I think back on the books that I used to love even 10-15 years ago, I don't know how I would feel about them if I were to read them today. I feel like there are some books that age quite well, but then I also feel like there's some books that don't age as well. So in today's vlog, I'm going to be reading the oldest and the newest horror books on my TBR. And so the two books that I've chosen to read are Misery by Stephen King and The Other People by C.J. Tudor. So Misery came out in, I think it was 1987. Let me just double check. Yeah, so Misery was published in 1987 and The Other People was published this year. I think it came out in January. I have read a few Stephen King books before, but it was quite a long time ago. I think it's been about 10 years since I last read a Stephen King book. I have read The Chalk Man by C.J. Tudor earlier this year, and I did really enjoy it. I could see as I was reading it that it was very similar to Stephen King. So yeah, really excited to see how I feel about these two books. I think I'm going to start with Misery first, and I'll update you once I'm maybe about 50 to 100 pages in. If you enjoy this video, then please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments if there's any other genres that you'd like to see me do this with. The main reason why I've chosen horror for October is because it's October, Halloween's on its way, I think we're all craving those spooky vibes, and also I kind of feel like scaring the crap out of myself. Okay, so I made a start on Misery last night and I realised that I don't think I actually explained what this book is about, which would probably be a good idea. So basically we're following a guy called Paul Sheldon, who is this really famous author. He's most well known for writing a book series about a woman called Misery. However, Paul doesn't really want to write this series anymore. He appreciates that it's made him a lot of money and it's made him quite famous, but he wants to go on and write other things. So at the start of the book, we learn that Paul was in this car accident, and the opening chapter, we're inside his mind as he drifts in and out of consciousness. And it turns out that he's been rescued by this woman who claims to be his biggest fan, and she's taken him back to her home where she's kind of feeding him painkillers and nursing him back to health. But over the course of the first few chapters, we learn that something isn't quite right, because why hasn't she phoned for an ambulance? Why hasn't she taken him to a hospital? And we know that she's about to start reading the last book in the Misery series, and we know that she's probably not gonna like the ending. I like that it's got quite short chapters because most of the book is set in this one room, and so it would be quite easy for the pace to be a little bit off and a little too slow, but because it's got those shorter chapters, it's moving quite quickly. And I didn't sleep very well last night, and I'm not sure whether it's because I was stressed about work or because I read for an hour before bed and it seeped into my brain and just, yeah. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. I'm going to read some more like later this evening and probably do an update once I'm about halfway through. Hey everyone, so it's now the next day and I did read for a little bit last night. I'm now about just under halfway through, so not quite as far as I wanted to be, but I think I mentioned I've been really tired this week. Like I've not been sleeping very well, so I just kind of like read for a little bit and then fell asleep. But I am enjoying it so far, or I'm enjoying it about as much as it's possible to enjoy a book that's basically about a man getting tortured, because the whole plot of this is revolving around the fact that Annie, the kidnapper, didn't like the ending of Paul's latest book, and that's not a spoiler, it's actually mentioned on the back cover. So she's forcing him to rewrite, or she's forcing him to write a new book that basically undoes everything that she felt was wrong with the ending of the last book. But yeah, basically if he doesn't do what she tells him to, then she does these horrible things to him. And I don't think I've even got to the worst parts yet. I don't know if I mentioned, but I have seen the film Misery, the one that came out in the 80s, or was it the 90s? But I have seen the film and it was good. Like I watched it with my dad and I enjoyed it, but I can't really remember a lot of what happened, and so I can't really say if it's a true adaptation. Like I know that it really creeped me out, but yeah, I'm gonna make another start on this. I'm on my lunch break right now, so I'm gonna read for another 10 minutes and I'll do another update hopefully this evening if I don't fall asleep. So I've just got to the end of part 2. I'm about 2/3 of the way through, and if you've read this book, then you might be able to guess what part I've got to. I was talking to my dad quite recently about trigger warnings in books and how I always try to include trigger warnings in my reviews. And this book has all of the trigger warnings. But I also think that to a certain extent, when you go into a Stephen King book, you kind of know what you're getting yourself into. Like, because it's a horror, you know to a certain extent that there's going to be horror themes. But then I suppose you wouldn't necessarily know to what extent. This is quite graphic. It is quite psychological, like the fear and the suspense and the way that it builds things up. I do wonder sometimes whether over time we've become a little bit more desensitized to things like horror. But I can safely say that in this case, I am not desensitized. This is.
Your color is very hectic. What have you been doing?
You know damn well what I've been doing. I've been sitting here suffering.
I wanted to talk quickly about Stephen King in general because I feel like Stephen King isn't an author that I tend to recommend. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but I feel like when people hear that I've read Stephen King, they'll always ask, "Oh, what Stephen King book would you recommend?" You don't often get, or at least in my experience, I don't often get people come to me and say, "Would you recommend Stephen King?" I feel like if you know that you want to read Stephen King, then you know that you want to read Stephen King, in the same way that if you know that you don't want to read Stephen King, then you know that you don't want to read Stephen King. But I do feel like if you're looking to read Stephen King and you've not read Stephen King before, then Misery is quite a good place to start, because I think he's taken what is a really quite simple concept, but it's been executed quite well, and it is genuinely like gross and scary. So I finished reading Misery last night and I did really enjoy it in the end. I was kind of in between a 3 and a 4 star, but I did give it 4 stars in the end. I feel like the last third in particular, it really started to pick up the pace. And I do feel like sometimes Stephen King books have really weird endings, really disappointing endings, but I didn't find that with this. Like, the ending was still weird, but it wasn't so weird that I didn't enjoy it. So yeah, 4 stars. I wouldn't say that it's my favourite Stephen King book. I still feel like I enjoyed Pet Sematary slightly more, but it's been so long since I read it that I would like to reread it at some point just to see how I still feel about it. I feel like the main reason why this wasn't a 5-star read is because throughout the book, we're seeing Paul write this book within the book, and I feel like the pages where it has his book that he's writing weren't needed. Like, I'll see if I can find an example. I don't know if you can see that, but all of these pages are where Paul has wrote this book, and so it's not even part of the main story, and it's interesting, but it's not necessarily needed, and I don't know whether it adds enough that it's worth breaking up the pace for. So I think if those were slightly shorter, maybe like a page or two rather than like 20 pages, then this would have been quite easily a 5-star read. So I have made a start on The Other People by CJ Tudor, or I say I've made a start on it, I've read like the first 2 chapters, but I just thought I'd explain a little bit about what it's about, or what I understand it's about based on what I've read so far. So we're following this guy who is driving home and he's stuck in a little bit of traffic, and he notices the car in front of him, and through the back window of this car in front appears this little girl. She's like 5 or 6, and he notices that it looks a little bit like his daughter, and she mouths at him, "Daddy," and he thinks it looks a lot like her, but it can't be her because his daughter is at home and that's where he's driving to now. But because he's a little bit concerned and his phone battery's died, he pulls over at the next services and calls home using the payphone, and this detective answers and he asks, like, "Where is my wife?" And she tells him, "Look, something has happened," and from what I understand, they've gone missing. But yeah, it sounds like it's going to be quite creepy. Obviously, I don't know what direction it's going to go in, I don't know what's going to happen, but I am excited to find out. So I'm over a third of the way through now, and I was going to do another update, but I don't really feel like I've got much more to say. In terms of the plot, I don't really have a clue what's going on. Like, I mean, I kind of do. So we're following a few different perspectives. We've got this guy, Gabe, who has been told that his wife and daughter are dead, but he's convinced that he saw his daughter that day in the back of a car. And so he's spending all his time driving up and down the motorway trying to work out what happened. The book is set kind of like a few years in the future after that first chapter. And then we also have a few other perspectives, but I don't really know how they link into the main story. I think I might have worked out something, but I'm not sure. Like I said, this book is really weird. Like, it's good, it's got really short chapters, and so I feel like the pace is moving quite quickly, and there's been a few like cliffhangers, a few things hinted at. There might be something supernatural going on, but yeah, not really sure. So I'm 70% of the way through now, and I wanted to do one last update because I think I might actually finish this tonight. It's actually a lot shorter than I thought it was. I think the whole book is less than about 350 pages, so really, really quick. And what I thought was happening when I mentioned earlier has been confirmed. But it's one of those things where, are you ever reading a book and you think you've worked something out and then it's revealed and you're not sure if it's a twist or whether you were meant to have worked that out? I don't know. I can't tell how subtle or how obvious like the story is. But yeah, I am really enjoying this. I think that it's probably more of a psychological thriller rather than horror. Like it's a psychological thriller but with horror elements rather than it being like outward gore. But I would recommend this if you like books that have that kind of subtle build up where things are revealed as part of the plot but gradually. And so there are occasions where you don't really know what's going on and it keeps you on your toes. I also think that this book is a really good bridge. So if you know that you like thrillers, but you're looking to move into horror, then I think that this is a really good book to start with. Hey everyone, so I finished reading The Other People last night and I really enjoyed it. Like, I think that the pacing was good throughout the book, but the suspense towards the end really picked up, and I had to keep reading because I knew that I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I knew what happened. And so I think I finished it about midnight. But yeah, really good. I gave it 4 stars in the end. The only reason I didn't feel like I could give it 5 stars is because there's a little supernatural element to the story that I didn't really get. I don't know whether I just didn't really understand it, but I didn't think that it really added much, and I think the book would have been just as good without it in there. I feel like it's one of those books where you just kind of have to go with the flow. Like, there's some bits that are a little bit far-fetched and a little bit unbelievable, but it didn't take away from my enjoyment. I mean, I finished it in a day, so that pretty much tells you all you need to know. I thought I'd finish the vlog just by talking about the 2 books together and maybe not compare them directly, because I do think that they're both very different books, but I did enjoy them both just for very different reasons. So in terms of the plot, I think that the plot for Misery was very simple, but it was executed well. I just think that the main driving force behind the book is the characters and their interactions together. The Other People has a slightly more complicated plot, but I don't think that it's actually complicated. When you break it down, I think that it's more that it's difficult to explain. But I think it's the kind of book where you're better off going into it without knowing too much anyway. When you look at the characters, I think that the characters in Misery, because you only have 2 main characters, there's a few like side characters, but you do have the 2 main characters that the book focuses on. And I think that they're developed and they're described in a really, really good way. Because there's only those 2 characters, you get that really good development. And I felt like I could feel what Paul was going through. I think that the book did a really good job of putting me inside his head. The characters in The Other People weren't as distinctive, and I don't know whether this is just me, but it's something that I've noticed quite a lot in more modern horrors and more modern thrillers, in that they tend to be more plot driven rather than character driven, and I don't mind that like at all. Like I said, I still really enjoy The Other People, but I do think that the focus was more on the plot and developing that more than the characters. But I did find that the characters weren't as memorable, and I don't know if in 6 months, if you ask me about these characters, whether I'd be able to tell you anything about them. Something that I think is really important in thrillers and in horrors is building terror and suspense, and both of these books I think did an amazing job. I literally couldn't pick which was better between the 2 of them. I think that in Misery it was very drawn out and it built up really slowly, whereas in The Other People it was more consistent, but I was still on the edge of my seat, especially towards the end. And CJ Tudor has been quite open about the fact that Stephen King has been a huge inspiration for her as a writer, and I think that you can definitely see that in her books, or at least the 2 books that I've read of hers. In terms of goriness, is that a word? Like, in terms of the gore, Misery wins hands down. Like, that book is gross, like I can't even explain. I think that even if you've seen the film, you have to be prepared for it going in, because some parts were quite difficult to read, and I'm not squeamish usually, but it was hard. Finally, I'm just going to mention the pacing, because I feel like in Misery it got off to a really good start. I think the beginning and the end of Misery, the pacing was really good, but because in the middle you had large chunks of text from the book that Paul was writing, it did slow it down a little bit. And some people might disagree with me here, but I feel like you could skim read those parts and it wouldn't really make much difference to the book. But yeah, in terms of the pacing, I think The Other People wins hands down. It's consistently good throughout the book, and like I said, it had me on the edge of the seat. I had to keep reading because I had to know what happened. I think this video might have been a little bit more interesting if I'd liked one book over the other, but I genuinely couldn't pick between the two of them. I liked them both equally, and I gave them both 4 stars. Stephen King has said some really questionable things in the past, and I'm going to be honest, it has put me off reading his books, but I do think that's a whole other conversation on whether you can separate an author from their books. But I do hope that with this video I've shown that there are other options out there if for whatever reason you don't want to read Stephen King, or you're not sure if Stephen King books would be for you. If you've enjoyed this video, then please don't forget to click subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!